Mixed martial arts. No one else talks about it. Except us. On the ball.
Dublin City FM.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's MMA on Dublin City FM, courtesy of the On The Ball Sports Show, and we will be back with Declan and the guys in about 15 to 20 minutes after we go over all the week's news and reviews in mixed martial arts. Usually you can catch the show around a couple of minutes past 4 every Sunday here, and you can get the archives at thisaintfake.com. Not joined again by Ken this week, he's off on holidays, so all the best to him. He'll be returning next week to talk about everything that's happened in between, and boy has a lot happened in between. We'll take a step back to 2 nights ago. An upstart promotion, if you will, had their foyer on pay-per-view, their first time on it, and one of the more interesting things coming about the Battleground MMA promotion, as they're known, is their choice in commentary team. A lot of pro wrestling and mixed martial arts fans were very excited about the pairing of Chael Sonnen and Jim Ross, who for the first time ever were partnering up to do what they could do behind the mic in terms of getting this promotion into the minds and knowledge of MMA fans. It harkened back to UFC days of old, in fact, the format being a knockout tournament, all to take place on the one show. In terms of the commentary, just going back to the team, Jim Ross, obviously mostly known for his WWF/WWE tenure in the 90s and 2000s. He was the voice of the company when they had their highest heights, during such names being on top as Steve Austin and The Rock. Some extremely famous calls by Jim Ross in featuring shouting Austin's name several times after he won his first championship at WrestleMania 14. Maybe his most notable of all was when Mick Foley got thrown off the Hell in a Cell by Undertaker at King of the Ring 98, and he said, "Good God, they've broken him in half." He was a pivotal part of professional wrestling as well when it came to signing talent. He was the head of talent relations, in fact, for a lot of his tenure in the company. What does this have to do with MMA? It has a lot to do with MMA in the sense that Jim Ross has always been a fan of what one might say are pure natural athletes. He wasn't exactly somebody who cherry-picked a lot of professional wrestlers off the independent circuit, as much as he looked for people with football backgrounds, and football backgrounds primarily that had transitioned into professional wrestling before they got to a level that he could sign them for Vince McMahon's organization. A lot of notable people that he did sign were names that I before mentioned, Steve Austin, The Rock, so forth. But Brock Lesnar was somebody that Jim Ross and Gerald Briscoe had a very, very big hand in signing. And if it wasn't for that and his exposure in WWE, one would doubt that his UFC run would have been as mainstream a success as it did eventually become. We move on to the American gangster Chael Sonnen. He was sitting in the hot seat doing colour commentary. Now, if anybody has ever heard Chael Sonnen, before the WEC days, he was actually used as a colour commentator a lot for mixed martial arts and other various martial arts events. He kind of held back in terms of how wacky he would once become when he got a chance to speak as a performer himself on the mic, when he was bolstering his profile as a mixed martial artist. But that was not the case at Battleground on Friday night. Chael was being his usual self. Jim Ross was slightly shaky at the start. For those of you wanting to hear such catchphrases as "stomp a mud hole in him" or "slobber knocker," you were unfortunately going to be disappointed. He was different to a lot of mixed martial arts commentators in the sense that his product knowledge was clearly different. Maybe product knowledge isn't the right way to put it. His knowledge of the general working of the sports and the ins and outs were maybe not up to par of what we would be used to when we listen to Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg. He was trying to tell stories. He was doing very much what harkened back to his professional wrestling roots in the 80s would have been when he worked for Bill Watts in WCW. For instance, there was a couple of little stories he would give on people that were new to the fans. Unless you were hardcore MMA supporter, you might know a lot of the names that were in this tournament. Now, one might also say if you weren't a hardcore MMA supporter, you probably didn't tune in anyway. That might be irrelevant. Trey Houston was one of the supposedly unknown fighters. Jim Ross had a lot of background on him, saying that he worked a job as a geophysicist in an oil company. He had little tidbits here and there. As the night went on, he settled in slightly more. The biggest critique I would have for the commentary, and it's not from want of trying, because these two are obviously in transition periods at the moment. Jim Ross hasn't worked for a while as a commentator. He had a slight run in a boxing show a few months back. But besides that, he's been pretty much just sticking to podcasts and writing. Chael Sonnen obviously was let go from the UFC and Fox due to his drug suspensions. And he's been looking for something new to do. So it was definitely in their best interest that they gelled well. That they did. What they didn't really do was kind of inform people of when a finish was about to happen. There was never kind of an air of suspense. If you were watching it with the sound off and you knew your mixed martial arts well, there was points before submissions and finishes that you'd say to yourself, this guy looks like he's on the ropes. They didn't really clue you in on that. There was no build to excitement. There is no kind of, we better watch out, he looks like he's in trouble kind of calling. It was a very different, unique style. Not one that I think would be the way to broadcast mixed martial arts moving forward, but it's definitely interesting to see where they start off and where they might eventually end up. The biggest story going into this event as well was former UFC featherweight Cody McKenzie. Now, he was brought into this to fight 2 weight classes up. It was a welterweight tournament. So he was usually going into the cage in UFC. I believe he was at 145 or 155. He came into this obviously trying to hit 170. He actually missed weight. He came in at 171 pounds. He said that he'd been working the last 2.5 months on a salmon fishing boat in Alaska, and he hadn't trained well or looked the part. He said that a lot of his idea in terms of getting down to the actual weight would be donating blood beforehand. So this already kind of shows the perhaps level of importance that the fighters deemed this event, especially those who had made their name elsewhere beforehand. It's worth checking out. It wasn't the most exciting night of fighting. For those of you who exclusively just watch the tippy top MMA promotions, UFC to be precise, the production values weren't quite there either. But for those of you who are fans of Chael Sonnen and Jim Ross, I would certainly say it's a very interesting insight into their partnership that obviously they hope to move forward with as a broadcasting team. Speaking of UFC, we'll move on to last night, where we had 2 UFC cards ran on the same night. Anytime they do this, I scratch my head, but then again, they're trying to have pockets in each global market where they feel they can run on the same night and still generate as much interest if the local market is hot enough. There was also a lot of Irish interest going in on account of Paddy Houlihan having his first fight since UFC in Dublin, Gunnar Nelson and Cathal Prendard also having their first fights since UFC Dublin. That's what we'll look at first. So this was basically billed as UFC Fight Night, Nelson versus Story. Gunnar Nelson headlining his first UFC show. It took place in Stockholm, Sweden. Obviously Gunnar is from Iceland, adopted by SBG Ireland as one of our own. So without, I guess, having it slightly up north was close to having it at home. They felt he was the right person to headline the card anyway. There's not a tremendous amount of Swedish fighters to choose from. So that main event unfortunately saw Gunnar Nelson's first defeat in the UFC. It was a split decision against Rick Story. 47-48, 49-46 for Gunnar. 47-48, 49 for Gunnar, 49-46 and 50-44. The other 2 judges scored it for Story. So it's interesting that the split decision was 47-48, but another judge had it 50-44. Regardless, Gunnar was unsuccessful. It was an interesting fight. It was a very technical fight. It was the first time that Gunnar did look in trouble. That's for sure. Rick Story obviously is a slightly higher level welterweight than Gunnar Nelson is used to going against. So that created some problems. It is, no matter what way you slice it, and the fact obviously it wasn't a knockout or a submission would maybe help you think differently, but whatever way you slice it, it's a setback for Gunnar Nelson and not one that the Irish fans or the Icelandic fans were hoping to see. So all the best with Gunnar moving forward. It'll be very interesting to see what they do next. One thing for sure, with George St. Pierre out of the picture and the welterweight division going over somewhat of a facelift, I'm sure the UFC would have liked nothing more than Gunnar Nelson to progress in his career as he had been doing to this point. Going back to what we were saying earlier about having stars in global markets, Gunnar Nelson would have been perfect to have for the Scandinavian market. So we'll see what they do with him next. Hopefully he can get back on the train. Hopefully he'll be able to get a couple of wins in the column between now and this time next year. The semi-main event of the show was Max Holloway against Akira Kasani. Max Holloway won. KO punches in the first round. Looked very, very impressive. On the undercard, we're just going to skip to what the Irish interest would be, which is called Prendered. Obviously, fighting King at the last Dublin show came out after he had won. The King was busted for performance-enhancing substances, which made Cahill's victory even more important. This wasn't quite as dramatic as the fight against King in Dublin, but it was certainly close. Cahill coming out the victor, thankfully. He was going against Ghassan Utmatlov. Decision was split, 29-28 for Cahill, 28-29 for Ghassan, 29-28 for Cahill. So very much a split can get decision. But regardless, he gets the win, and we were very, very happy to see that. It was a good performance by Cahill, and his trademark of showing heart and resilience and battling till the very end was evident again last night in Stockholm, Sweden. Moving over to the North American continent for our second UFC of last night. UFC Fight Night, MacDonald versus Saffiedine. This was taking place in Halifax, Nova Scotia, up in Canada, and Rory MacDonald won. So obviously people were very, very happy. Rory MacDonald, of course, has been a bright hope of the welterweight division for some time, and of course hometown hero up in Canada. He's from British Columbia. Obviously the event took place in Nova Scotia, but the point being, he was headlining the show for a reason. Rafael Ansunsao defeated Brian Caraway. So obviously Brian Caraway, known mostly for being Mr. Miesha Tate at this point, and his UFC career, it's almost, I think, when you look back at the last couple of fights, nothing seems to outshine the fact that, you know, he had his run on The Ultimate Fighter. He's known more as an accessory to Miesha Tate at this stage. A win here would have done great stuff for him moving forward out on his own, but that wasn't going to be the case. It was a unanimous decision for Rafael, 30-27, 30-27 and 30-27. Overall, it was just one of those cases where you look at these two cards and they're just very big cards, and you think maybe if it was a joint effort, obviously it would be very hard to do on account of they were trying to promote one for Canada and one for Sweden, and trying to appeal to both fans respectively. Regardless, running two shows on one night is just something that I am personally not a fan of. You really, really need to be so dedicated to watching mixed martial arts if you wanted to watch the prelims and main card on both shows. Speaking of the prelims in Canada, Patrick Houlihan unfortunately went down to Chris Cadales, which we were just all very upset about. So overall, it wasn't a great night for the Irish and adopted Irish, having Gunnar go down and Paddy Houlihan go down. He did Facebook straight after his fight saying to go out on the sword or to go out with it. Either way, he was, you know, very honoured with all the support he got. He got a tremendous amount of support. He's kind of maybe the person that we don't really talk about as much when it comes to Irish mixed martial arts. Cahill, Gunnar, Conor, all been around slightly longer, respectively, in the UFC. Patrick Houlihan, however, shows tremendous amount of heart. The decision was a unanimous one, 29-28, 29-28, 29-28 against Patrick Houlihan. So to see what happens with him next is going to be very, very interesting. Sticking on the Irish theme, myself and Declan last week, we're talking about what is next for Conor McGregor. The idea that they were going to fly him down to the next UFC pay-per-view 179, which is taking place in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He was going to be placed in the front row, is the last thing we heard. The main event, of course, featherweight championship, Jose Aldo against Chad Mendes. The idea of flying him down to be in the front row is obviously to give the impression that he's the next in line for the title shot, depending on who won that fight coming up on October 25th. However, he himself came out this week, said he was going to switch weight classes in order to go against Diego Shanchez in Mexico City. Now, this was a bit of a head scratcher. He's been so great at featherweight in the UFC, not that he can't go up different weight classes. Obviously, he came into UFC being a double champion in two different weight classes in Cage Warriors. But why they would do this against Diego Shanchez in Diego Sanchez's home country, while he himself admittedly is kind of on a downward turn, it was a head scratcher. Dana White came out very quickly after Conor had announced this and said that this just wasn't the case. He didn't allude to what exactly he was going to do with Conor McGregor yet. They didn't talk about him flying down for the Brazil show on October 25th again. He just categorically said this will not be happening. Diego Shanchez and Conor McGregor is not going to happen. A few reports coming out of some sources in the States, of all places, said that Conor McGregor not only had made this announcement off his own back, but he had also informed his fighting team, his coaching staff, that this fight was going to happen. Supposedly, after UFC last week, Conor had gone out for dinner with the powers that be, and he had asked for this fight. They had declined, but he decided that it would be in his best interest to go out on his own and just make this fight. So that won't be happening. If he is, however, in the front row on October 25th, we're going to get what we really want, which is the idea of Conor McGregor being crowned number one contender for the featherweight championship, sitting alongside the cage watching Jose Aldo against Chad Mendes. So that's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens next. But again, when that came out, people's reaction was, it was very, very fun to watch. Another UFC box office has fallen by the wayside with Gina Carano. Basically, she's going back into Hollywood. She'll be shooting some films in October and December. One with Dave Bautista of WWE and mixed martial arts fame. He basically said, Dana White, that being in a press conference recently, that the Carano issue was dead in the water. So they will be moving straight from Ronda Rousey to Kat Zingano, most likely. It's kind of an interesting one, because when you look at Ronda Rousey and how far she's grown and come in the UFC, and how well she's done on box office against all the naysayers and begrudgers so far, one would like to think that she would have other opponents on the horizon. Of course, with Cyborg, there's the obvious issue of the weight cut. Now, Cyborg has gone down to that weight now for her next Invicta fight, so that's potentially now again back on for the future. But people thought that if they went from Ronda and Carano to Ronda and Cyborg, you'd be getting the most out of Rousey. And why would you need to get the most out of Rousey now? Well, simply because she is following in the footsteps of one Gina Carano. She is now being featured in films. She's been offered scripts. She's becoming a superstar that's transcending the sport. She looks incredible. She's got the most incredible skills of any woman, female fighter on the planet at the moment, and Hollywood are pining to have her as a full-time film star. So we will see what happens there. The Carano fight would have been interesting from a marketable point of view. From a pure sporting point of view, I wouldn't really rate Carano as any sort of challenge against her. So more of this as it comes out over the next little while. What Rousey will do next, what her next fight will be. Again, Kat Zingano has been the most heavily tipped. So that's pretty much all from myself this week. Ken will be back after his holidays, so we look forward to having him back, talking to him about all the mixed martial arts news, especially when it comes relating to the Irish fighters. Hopefully we'll have more on what they're going to be doing with Conor McGregor next week as well. And again, all the best to Patrick Houlihan, Cathal Prendard and Gunnar Nelson, who in one way or another were representing the country last night and gave it their best. We'll be back a little bit after 4 o'clock next week.
On the ball.
Dublin City FM.